their loved ones, only for the Pentagon to reclassify these documents as soon as they were requested. When the wife of one MIA wrote to President Reagan, he replied that his administration had planned a rescue raid for the MIA by Green Berets under the command of Colonel Bo Gritz in 1981. Excuse me, the official line was that no U.S. MIA remained alive in Indochina, but a raid was being held according to President Reagan. Some sense of the contradictions and denials of the White House was made by the authors Monica Jensen Stevenson and William Stevenson in their 1990 book Kiss the Boys Goodbye. The Stevensons reported that Dr. Henry Kissinger negotiated a secret clause in the Paris Peace Accord, which ended the war. In Vietnam, whereby the U.S. would pay North Vietnam $4 billion in reparations in return for POWs held by Hanoi. The U.S. then reneged on the reparations, and the POWs stayed in Vietnam. We had thousands of Americans after the release of 1973. A Vietnamese secret police chief informed the Stevensons. Confirmation of the Stevensons case came in 1992 with the testimony of Richard Allen before Senator John Kerry's Senate Select Committee on the fate of the American MIA. Allen informed the committee that in 1981, Vietnam had offered to free the POWs it still held, some dozens, if the U.S. handed over the $4 billion it had originally promised. The offer was rebuffed by the Reagan government because it was not willing to pay ransom money for hostages, a piece of high-mindedness that apparently ended at the border of Iran. In 1987, Reagan confessed on TV that he had traded arms for American hostages and funneled the funds to the Contras in Nicaragua. So why not do the same thing in Vietnam? Some observers, however, considered that the Reagan rebuff was simply because his administration wanted to close down the MIA POW issue for fear of exposing the U.S.'s illegal operations in Laos, which borders Vietnam, where many POWs were believed to be held. According to whistleblowing CIA agents, there were any number of embarrassing schemes operated by the agency in Laos, from drug running to arms sales, waiting to be turned into headline news by the media. Better than to sacrifice the POWs and keep newshound noses out of Laos. So, John Rambo had it right. There really were MIA POWs left behind in Vietnam. Sadly, the chances of any POWs being left alive today, after 30 years of privation and imprisonment, are remote. The U.S. government deliberately failed to rescue MIAs and POWs left behind in Vietnam. The alert level given to this conspiracy is level 8, meaning that it's obviously true, it was proven to be correct. So it's really not a conspiracy. This actually happened. I remember watching Rambo. I don't remember which Rambo it was. I guess it was this one. On video this was, just a fact that these were casualties of war, that people were left behind when there was a very abrupt pullout from Vietnam. There were people, because it's the way that the war was conducted in Vietnam. Many of these situations occurred in remote areas, in jungle, places that people couldn't get to, and so even when the troops were to be released, there were many people that were hidden away in all of these remote places, that were not released, and that were basically, I guess, were going to be held for ransom. And there were a lot of little mini warlords within the Viet Cong. It wasn't just like a set army that followed a single commander. There were these little mini warlords, little village warlords, and so if any of them captured somebody, they didn't necessarily go by whatever the official request was. If the general of the army said, okay, release everybody, the smaller warlords in the jungles didn't abide by that. But if they could get, some money or some food or something for this lone American, or maybe a handful of Americans that they had found, then they were willing to use it to that end. And I'm sure that stuff like that was happening throughout the war. But then when the war abruptly ended, a lot of these little warlords were still hanging on to the soldiers that they had captured, and they were not necessarily part of the official record. Nobody was looking for them. Once they got supposedly lost in the jungles, people just assumed they had passed, and even if they had been captured, since so many years had passed, people were not looking for them. I think this is very interesting that somebody had actually requested information from Reagan, and he responded saying that, yeah, we are sending a secret group of Green Berets to capture that individual and bring him back. Obviously, the official story is going to be different because they don't want to admit that anyone was left behind. But the fact that even a response was given is kind of interesting. And then this other part of the deal that was negotiated by Kissinger, that's even more disturbing, where a secret deal was made to release all of the extra soldiers for a huge amount of money. The reason that it was probably $4 billion, the government was going to take the majority of that, but then they had to pay off these little, I'm calling them warlords, but these little village people who had captured various Americans in all parts of the country, in order to pay them off, in order to release those individuals that they had caught. They needed money to pay them. They probably didn't need $4 billion. The majority of that was going to go to the government, but they wanted some money in order to pay off those guys. When no money was given, they didn't really care. They just left them, I guess, or they waited for a certain amount of time. Maybe individuals, families might have even been contacted. I don't really know. I don't think it was that organized at this time that they could, call anybody and try and get money from the individual families. The way that maybe something I've heard that has happened in the recent situations where journalists or factory workers who have been captured in Middle Eastern countries, sometimes they tell them, call my family, and they have a cell phone, and so then they can call them, and they directly request money from those family members. A lot of times the government gets involved, and so then a person may not be able to bargain with those, in the hostage situation. But at that time, in the 60s and 70s, there really wasn't a methodology, especially for, people that had been captured in jungle environments that are very primitive. It was basically an impossibility. It was really just if somebody was looking for a particular soldier, and the government in particular maybe wanted them, maybe they were a commander or somebody's son, that conspiracy. I think everyone kind of knew that a huge amount of men did not come back, and it's understandable that their family would think, oh no, something, something, it wasn't a situation that something happened to them. They're actually kept there, especially when they would talk to their other battalion members, other people in their group, and they said, no, that person, kind of disappeared with 5 or 6 other people. And so then it makes sense that, oh, maybe they were captured. Maybe they even heard that they were captured, because situations like that even occurred. I think in the Stevenson book it even mentioned a situation like that where other members of the team knew that warlords had captured those soldiers because those guys were asking for money in return for the soldiers, so they knew they weren't dead. And when those soldiers came back, they told the family members that no, that person was alive, at least last they heard. But it's impossible for the family to do anything because of the remote location of where those people were held. So some of them, I guess the government was trying to pull out, but many of them, the ones that I guess they didn't have on their priority list, just weren't a priority for them to pull out. Now, this other aspect of the situation that I think is kind of interesting is the fact that the Reagan administration, quietly claims that, oh, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists, but yet they totally were trading. They were trading in Iran arms for hostages. That was, one of the major factors that brought down the Reagan administration was the Iran-Contra scandal, and it was a major scandal of his presidency in his second term. So the fact that when it was not to his benefit or to his administration's benefit, Reagan was really just a front man for, just like all presidents, they're just the front men for whatever the main, administrators, the other people involved in the government, are really pulling the strings and making decisions, but they didn't have a benefit in bringing back or spending money or necessarily paying $4 billion, to the Vietnamese, because there was nothing to gain from them compared to the Iran, Nicaragua, this situation, the Iran-Contra scandal. There was something to gain. There was a lot of money to be made. There was a lot of money being funneled in because arms were being sold, so there were businesses intact. They didn't have anything like that. Surface businesses in Vietnam, they had a lot of underground businesses, and that was the problem. A lot of black market stuff was going on, stuff that they didn't want to release or reveal. And I believe I read recently, maybe not that recently, but at some point I did read that a lot of the meth trade, actually, that was in a Rambo movie, I think, the latest one, or maybe the one just before, where he goes in back into the jungles of Asia. I'm not exactly sure if the country was mentioned specifically, but the fact that there was a major methamphetamine trade that was going on, and even in this little article, it mentions that there were a lot of like black market drug trade was happening during the 1980s. So by the 90s, methamphetamine had become a major black market business. Right at the same time, I think the reason that I read that article was the fact that right at the same time they had banned ephedra. I don't know if people remember that in I think it was 2006. They banned ephedra. Like, I used to take, every now and then I would need some Sudafed, and I couldn't get Sudafed outside of, you had to get it from the pharmacist now, and you had to show your ID. And a lot of times they had a much smaller box. It wasn't the original size, and there were like all these little issues, and that's the reason that I started looking into this ephedra ban, because I didn't even know about it. And the reason was because the Bush government at the time was saying that they were going to, they wanted to circumvent production in the United States. The thing is that the meth sales increased dramatically after the ban. So, what they were actually doing, according to this article, was stopping domestic production, or at least attempting to circumvent domestic production, because they owned foreign production that was occurring in these Asian countries. And Vietnam may have been one of them, Laos, whatever, all of these little the countries in that region may have been involved in the meth trade, and that's what the latest Rambo movie was insinuating, that there was a major meth business, methamphetamine business. And so it's interesting that that early Rambo movie was correct about the POWs, and I think maybe this last installment of Rambo may have also been correct, that those countries are still useful as a black market um, drug trade, and that there's a major black market drug trade going on in those countries, and they supply um, products like methamphetamine all over the world, and governments have made an effort to reduce domestic production, but that's because the domestic production was their competition. They still wanted to sell the meth. They weren't meth sales increased. Domestic production might have gone down, but the sales increased. So that's kind of interesting. Obviously, the drugs are coming from somewhere. Somehow they're able to get into the country. So that's an interesting concept. It is kind of a side note to this POW situation, but the fact that that movie was correct and insinuated a new theory as well, and the fact that Reagan, was doing the exact same thing of trading hostages for, some sort of a money deal when it wasn't to his benefit, to the administration's benefit. They claim that they don't negotiate with terrorists, but really, they didn't want to expose their undercover or black market drug sales that apparently continue on to this day. So, this was given an alert level of 8, meaning, I don't remember if this goes from 1 to 8 or what, but I should check that. But meaning that it's true, it's not even a conspiracy. I don't know where it says. Okay, anyway, it's a high level, because the last one was at an alert level of 3, meaning that it still lies in the realm of conspiracy, but this one, being a higher number, it actually turned out to be correct. There are, hopefully, there aren't any right now, because that would just be the worst experience, to be locked up in a situation for 30 years, but those POWs, there were POWs left behind in Vietnam. So that was the second conspiracy. That's really not a conspiracy, but I guess more of a fact, a sad fact.